Ladies and gentlemen, I think we may slowly start, if you feel like, David.
Of course, certainly. Yeah.
So at the beginning, I would like to say a few words. That, of course, this is my enormous pleasure and honor to host today David Elliott with his lecture titled "What Makes Exhibition of Contemporary Art Significant," and this is the third of the series of lectures that I have initiated with the collaboration and organized by the Faculty of Painting and Drawing of the University of Arts in Poznań, with support of the Dean of Painting, Tomasz Kalitko, of the Faculty of Painting and Drawing. And the series of online lectures is dedicated to encounter with the critical thought of the most renowned contemporary theoreticians, art critics, curators, and artists. And at the time of the pandemic, solitary confinement, I we believe that with our effort, the forced physical distance can be reshaped into the advantage of the greater proximity in exchange of ideas. David Elliott has sent me a note, which I would say is rather modest comparably with the all achievements of this extremely, in my opinion, important in our times, a curator. But I will allow myself to read now a few words about David. David Elliott was born in Manchester in 1949, and he's a British art historian, curator, writer, and teacher who has directed museums in Oxford, Museum of Modern Art. Then from 1976 to 1996, Museum of Moderna Museet in Stockholm, from 1996 to 2001, and Tokyo Mori Art Museum. He was a founding director of it, and from 2001 to 2006. Also Istanbul Museum of Modern Art in 2007, and Guangzhou Hereditary Museum of Contemporary Art. He was a vice director and senior curator from 2015 and 19. He has been the artistic director of major biennales in Sydney in 2010, Kiev in 2012, and Moscow in 2014, and Belgrade in 2016. And has taught art history and museum studies at the University of Oxford between 1986 till 1996, and National University of Arts in Tokyo between 2002 to 2006, and Humboldt University in Berlin. He was a Rudolf Arnheim professor in the history of art in 2008, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong between 2008 and 2006. He's a specialist in Soviet and Russian avant-garde, as well as in modern and contemporary Asian art. He has published widely in these fields, as well as on many other aspects of contemporary art, art and trousers, tradition and modernity in contemporary Asian art. His most recent book, which will be published by the Art Asia Pacific Foundation in September in 2021. I would like also add a little comment from my side. I had the enormous pleasure to meet David Elliott during the exhibition that he curated at Moderna Museet in 1999, called After the Wall, which in my opinion was a very important show, as many of the shows that I would think are very much groundbreaking in terms of the concepts. Speaking of David Elliott curatorialship, in this I had the honor to participate in this show, which was a major revival of the European arts scene behind the wall. Speaking of the former Eastern European countries, and this was it was 1998 when we actually met David. So this is a great pleasure to have you here. Also, the other thing that I would like add, that before we met in person, I also have a pleasure to to meet your incredible curatorial achievement, I would say, to my opinion, as a student of Royal College of Art, which was the exhibition at the Highwood Gallery in 1995 called the Art and Power. And for the young student at the Royal College of Art, that was also something very, very important for me at the time. So without further ado, I would like to welcome David Elliott, and please, we're all yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's extremely generous of you. It all sounds terribly tiring when you list it out like that. Okay, I'm quite tired, but we have a talk to do, and I'm immediately energized by that thought. Of course, art after the wall, art and culture in post-communist Europe was 10 years after the fall of the wall in Berlin. And Bojana Pajic, I co-curated that with her, yeah, and a number of other people. Yes, this talk is called Between Pain and Desire. What makes large exhibitions of contemporary art significant, or what make large thematic exhibitions of contemporary art significant. And Between Pain, which is the exhibition we start off with, it's really looking at what curators do. And they're kind of storytellers. They're telling stories which they devise, and they're picking up on stories which artists are involved with as well. And these, of course, stories of their life, which impinges in their art, but most importantly, the stories that their art put forward about what it's like to be living now, what it's like to be thinking now, what sort of things we experience. And these are different from different places. It sounds obvious to say that, but I really do think that some curators believe there's a Platonic ideal for exhibitions, that there is this perfect exhibition with the perfect artist in it, which you can parachute down anywhere in the world, and the grateful populace will be so thankful to be imbued with this wonderful exhibition. I think this is absolute bullshit. I mean, exhibitions are made by people for in places, in times. And to be any good, they have to reflect this. So I'm going to start showing some pictures. Just me, my entire screen. Press that. I press that. I press share. Now I hope very much you see something, which is I'm presenting my screen. It says.
Perfect.
Okay. I can see you, which is lovely. But I have to flip to see my screen because I can't see my screen, although you can. But I do that, and I just have to imagine your eyes and your souls out there. I know you're there. So these different stories, and I want to start it with Stockholm, which is really my first stop after Oxford. I spent 20 years working in Oxford, which isn't, it's not a record there. People spend whole lifetimes, but it seemed a long time. And I was asked to go out there to open their new building, which is it was an old site. And there's a view of Stockholm. Now, I hope you can see my arrow. There's the National Museum where my arrow is. Can you see my arrow?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay. That's the National Museum. And then this bridge, it's built on, I don't know, 15 islands, which leads to Skeppsholmen, where the museum is. So you get an idea. And this is Skeppsholmen, so we're looking at it from the other side, aerially. And the old museum was there, an old naval hall, because it's a naval base, and the Navy still owned everything there. So they were extremely restrictive on what could go on. There was old naval prison, which we'll come on to in a minute. But here you see the new museum. It's this reddish building. Quite why it's red, I don't know, but it's covered by trees there, and it has these very conical roofs like Osthouses. So there's lanterns at the top, which means that in this country, which for 6 months of the year is rather dark, you don't get much natural light. There's a church, which has now become a library, art library, National Art Library, which is wonderful. And there's another museum there, which is wonderful, called the East Asian Art Museum. So the building was surrounded by art. And this was done, it was founded in 1957. The building that I opened, of course, was opened in 1998. But already the island had developed in the Swedish mind as a kind of Arcadia, a kind of place where you could stroll in the surroundings and see these different kinds of art. And here we have, it's just one of a whole sequence of sculptures and fountains and machines put together by Jean Tinguely and Niki de Saint-Phal, which are still there. And they were very, very close to Pontus Hultén, who wasn't quite the founding museum director, but very, very nearly. And he really had stamped his imprint, an incredible personality on the place. And he was, and as a baby curator, museum director, he was one of my heroes. Just walking around to another aspect of the grounds, the Picasso's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, made out of concrete. And then a slightly more ironical public sculpture, Eric Dietmann's Monument to the Last Cigarette. What you can see here is what's on top of that column. So there was a place, an idea that it would be a place where people would wander. And the new museum was built into the side of the rock, and they really didn't want it to be a huge architectural statement. They wanted it to, quite rightly, to fit in with the nature, very Swedish idea. The trouble is fitting in. People found it very hard to find where the entrance was. And although this was, the photograph was taken after I had left, you can see they got absolutely worried about it because no one could find where the entrance is. They have these rather strange arrows there. There's a question of the logo as well, which again would have been over my dead body had I still been there, which was the handwriting of Moderna Museet by Robert Rauschenberg, who was an iconic figure in the collection. And what's interesting here is the old naval prison. And it's something that we co-opted very early on in the life of the museum, just for a short time to make some points. So that's looking down that side. You see these lantern roofs, the church at the end, library church, and this is the prison. And of course, you have the restaurant, where as soon as you walk in, you get the bookshop on your right-hand side and the restaurant with amazing view of the harbor. I used to have not quite such an amazing view of it, but I did see swans from my office window. And it's the Nordiska Museum across the water there. And
is that the location where you have the opportunity to play chess with death?
I always do that. I don't need a special place. Other than the kind of Arcadian sculpture around it, it had a collection, really a very good collection, built up over 25 years. This de Chirico was part of it, this Picasso, the Moselle period, neoclassical Picasso, Papier Découpé, Matisse, and the Rauschenberg, who's the man whose handwriting became the logo of the museum. It's iconic work from the 50s and 60s. James Rosenquist, this Petrolhead's Wet Dream. And so they're very strong in American art, in French art, and the Niki de Saint-Phal, Jean Tinguely, and the pop art. Did an Andy Warhol show very early on. We did 1968, a monograph, one of the first museum monographs, I think. And Pontus Hultén also did one of the things very close to my heart, a Vladimir Tatlin show in 1969. And he managed to locate the only technician left alive who had worked on the model for the monument of the Third International, otherwise known as Tatlin's Tower. And they reconstructed it. So what did I want to, coming in as an outsider from there, I had to set myself some objectives. Obviously, the first one, which had been set for me, was open this new museum. The architect had been chosen. The building was very much overdue. The architect was Rafael Moneo, who's an academic artist based in Madrid. And also I wanted to throw open some ideas of things that had seemed to go past the museum. After Pontus Hultén had left in the early 80s to become director of the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and examine ideas of what a modern and contemporary represent and how they relate to the present. We were Moderna Museet, and I mean, when I started working in the 70s, modern and contemporary were more or less interchangeable words. But by 1998, they weren't. Modern was historical, and postmodern was part of modern. And contemporary was something else, something entirely different. It was opening up in the climate of the Berlin Wall having fallen down, which of course Francis Fukuyama got terribly interested in, thinking that history had ended. It hadn't ended at all. It was just continuing, as it always does. And a contemporary which actually involves many, many different aspects, many different perspectives and views and cultures. And they all relate to the present because they're made now by artists, by people who regard themselves as artists. Showcase and critique the existing collection of the museum. I've shown you it was a wonderful collection, but there were some gaps. A museum had been without a director, I think, for 2 or 3 years before I arrived. So that was creaking as well. And there was a sense of tension in the air, in that they've been doing this big building project without a director. And there was a sort of nervousness, let's say. And I thought the inaugural exhibition, which is what I'm talking about, should really set a standard, should indicate artists' works and concerns for the future programs of the museum. Create ways of looking at and thinking about that are fresh, challenging, instructive. This sounds like our education program. Yeah, I mean, we all try and do that all the time. But it hadn't been said before then. Probe the strengths and weaknesses of the new building and its effect on both art and the visitors. And it was obvious from the beginning that this building did have a few problems. I mean, and no one could agree about it. I mean, one of the problems was its color. As you see, it's a kind of ochre color. The architect rightly wanted it a kind of gray, so it did disappear into the kind of fabric, the stone of the island. And no, people said gray is too depressing. We get too depressed by this. We have to have a jolly color. So he chose the ochre. And I asked Tomato, who are a London-based design firm, to look at a logo for the museum, which is this, and really build on the great modernist tradition of Sweden in design, and not kind of pastiche the kind of the IKEA idea of it, which had developed out of that. Now, this was one of the programs that we did when we first opened. This museum is full of art. Just to actually stress that it wasn't the restaurant that we're opening it for. It wasn't the bookshop. It was actually the art. And we were going to fill it. And we're going to make an exhibition there, which was really of an order they hadn't seen before. So Wounds, Between Democracy and Redemption in Contemporary Art. Heavy title. But democracy, I mean, Sweden, one of the leading social democracies in the world. Redemption, I was told by my head of education that no one no longer knew what redemption meant. I said, we've got a very good word for it there, Lösung. And he said, well, yes, but we don't know what it means. In the 60s, we stopped believing in God. Well, the idea, anyway, was between a collective ideal, a collective political, ideological ideal, and an individual struggle for significance, saving, not a religious idea at all, but actually to redeem oneself through one's actions, to take responsibility through one's actions. So it's setting up a twin pole. So Wounds, why Wounds? Well, it's firstly a tribute to the legacies of St. Thomas, that when someone put their hand into the side of him, when St. Thomas, put his hand into the side of Christ, what he thought he knew, what he knew would turn completely on their heads through experience. And what better than to use St. Thomas as a figure for the opening of a new art museum which was full of art, that you could only know what it was by experiencing it. It was experiencing, looking, of course, but also feeling it in a very different way. Not just looking and thinking, feeling. Martin Luther, it's a Lutheran country, although they claim to have lost God in the 1960s. Sigmund Freud, whose idea about the wound, that actually art, creativity came out of a sense of wounding, and that it was a healing process. And of course, Ingmar Bergman, who through many of his films reiterated the wounds that he himself felt were present. And these statistics, in a sense, are meaningless, but they're sort of helpful when you think about what had gone before. 236 works by 114 artists and filmmakers from 29 countries. And I guess the biggest show they'd had before, a thematic exhibition, which was about postmodernism in the late 80s, had between 30 and 40 artists in it. So it's really cranking something up. And I think a lot of art exhibitions and certainly art writing was extremely monographic. And I'm not against monographic approaches. I just think you have to do the monographic approaches to put them together in various themes. Now, the catalog, also designed by Tomato, was part of this. It's a 2-volume thing, you can see. There's a slipcase, there's volume 1, which has all the words in it, we asked many different writers, mainly from Europe, but not exclusively so, to contribute to the idea, to reflect on wounds. And then the illustration section opened up. You can see it folded out. There's a Jericho, Munch, and Diane Arbus. And then going on to the next page, the Diane Arbus flicks over, folds back, so to speak. So you have Francis Bacon 2 self-portraits opposite those. So the idea of folding and leafing and interleafing through that catalog was really following or trying to replicate as much as was possible the feeling of being in the galleries and walking around the exhibition, not only in one direction, but backwards and forwards, sideways, and turning around while you were looking to look across the room, and that kind of feeling. We put a newsprint, a chronology since the founding of the museum, 1959, up until the then present there, and then this other fold-in newsprint, which came in the bookcase, is Mark Wallinger on one side, and then on the other side was the film and video program. So the building itself was quite academic, and there were these long corridors with galleries off either side. On the right-hand side, you looked out in some of them, even with windows to the amazing view of the water. And at the end, then onto the island. This is a Joel Shapiro with the Andy Warhol cowl wallpaper there. So part of the collection was shown, and then part of the collection was also incorporated in the Wounds exhibition, and then a lot of other things were brought to it. Now, it started the exhibition really with the European Enlightenment, and the feeling that here you have an idea of artistic autonomy develops, I mean, particularly a Kantian idea of artistic autonomy, which is related to a moral feeling, but also a sense of empathy and conscience. And this was our starting point for modernity. And we showed it through this work by Jake and Dinos Chapman. It's a miniature version of the disasters of the war, all based on the Goya woodcuts. And of course, they're remade to look like children's toys, which makes them even more horrific. And this kind of mass production, they weren't mass produced, the edition was quite small, but this mass production element adds to that. And then going round the corner into the first gallery, excuse me, and looking back where you've come, there's a vista of 3 groups of paintings. On the right is a Teo Jericho, the Tête Décapitée. These were studies for the raft of the Medusa, which was again one of these first 1817, I think, maybe earlier, 1817, about decrying a scandal in the slave trade, in which a French royalist admiral had just cut people loose when his slaving ship had gone adrift, and he managed to save his own skin and a few others, but the others were just left to their own fate, and they were actually found, and they survived, and news got back to it through Paris. And it created a huge scandal, and this was the subject of the raft of the Medusa, which Jericho made. And then another key painting, I mean, we have Goya, we have Jericho, the death of Marat, I mean, David's famous painting, but this is Munch's reworking of it, personalizes and eroticizes it. That's Tule Larsen, his mistress at that time. They had a tiff. He shot himself, not in the foot, but in the hand. He was even bleeding there. And it kind of gives an updating of the kind of neurosis of this iconic image of revolution. And then Richard Hamilton's painting The State, something much closer to hand, certainly if you're British, and it's looking at the British military occupation of Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and it's entitled The State. Then really moving on and keeping the revolutionary topic, Ian Hamilton Finlay's 4 guillotine blades, very important Scottish artist who worked often by creating gardens and environments, but here he's made these guillotine blades in which he's put text by Poussin, Robespierre, Diderot, and himself, really about virtue, piety, and terror, the foundations of French republicanism. On a slightly lighter note, Rodney Graham's work, Vexation Island, also set itself in the 18th century. The moment of colonization in the Caribbean, and it's a looped image in which this man who's been run adrift, he's been cast away on a desert island completely alone, and he tries to escape to attract the attention of a ship. As he's standing up, a coconut falls from a tree and hits him on the head, knocks him out. And this is the point where he wakes up and then he sees a ship on the horizon again and tries to attract it. So it's an absurdist view. Andy Warhol meets Francis Bacon, car crashes, and the portrait of Auerbach, Frank Auerbach, and Lucian Freud. And you wouldn't normally put these together. They're 2 completely different kinds of painting, but they actually spoke, I mean, I think they did, spoke very well together. Gerhard Richter, Frau Niepenberg, these images from the early 60s, where he's reproducing the photographs, looking back at German history, referring to German history, or the lacunae within it. Less so here. Uncle Rudy was part of his family album. Or a mixture of the Heldenbilder of Georg Baselitz with Dick Bengtsson, a Swedish painter who was also interested in Romanticism, but from a rather more distanced and analytical view. Nearly all of his paintings had swastikas in them. And this is a very heimatlich image of a northern town. Could almost have been painted by the Führer himself, it's so bad.
I was going to say it looks remarkably like Hitler's own painting.
Yes, it does. It does, yeah. And he would insist on putting these swastikas in them. I just flip that quickly to here. On the right-hand side, you can see he's done a pastiche of an Edward Hopper painting, again with this swastika in it. Remember, Sweden was neutral, or so-called neutral, during World War II. And Dick Bengtsson, being Swedish, I mean, thought otherwise. These are kind of van der Vogel, the youth wandering through, hiking through the countryside. Yet they're modernists, as you can see. There's a Rothko, a Mondrian, and a Kandinsky in their backpacks. And it's 1973, this sort of identification of modernity with authoritarianism I found very, very interesting at this time. And then this kind of neo-pathetic masterwork by Baselitz, and much smaller paintings by Bengtsson, but then this monster, 250 by 3 meters, is really was really remarkable. And then really moving from the hero, or the pseudo-hero, to the body in different ways. And we didn't really plan to have a 3-legged competition, but we got one with these 2 works. And I should say that I was co-curating this exhibition with Pierluigi Tazzi, Italian curator who had worked with Jan Hut on his Documenta in 1993, I think. And then the body again, Escomanica, Man by Lake. These studies in isolation. We're always isolated men by themselves. Sorry, is anyone asking me something? Okay. Annika von Hauswolf, a Swedish young artist at that time, a landscape study. So you have this kind of very series of identical Aryan heads, we can say, in front of this generic forest landscape. And then something from Mike Parr. I don't know if some of you know his work. He's a performance artist from Australia, extremely strong. That is him and his wife. Going from the body, we also wanted to think about the 60s, the 1960s. And Pierluigi suggested this one, which I very willingly went along with, was really to remake Janis Kunelis's untitled 12 Horses, which had only been made twice. And Kunelis agreed to this, and it was this idea of stretching the building a little bit, making it a little less comfortable as well. And of course, there's issues about animal welfare and all of this, and also issues about air conditioning and not getting people allergens caught up in the air conditioning system. And we went to great lengths to make sure that the animals would be very carefully looked after. They would be changed over after an hour and a half, and they would be allowed to canter up and down along the island, lots and lots of things. And they were all coming up from a circus in Malmö when Kunelis came in, and he said, I'm terribly sorry. Well, he didn't say I'm terribly sorry. He said, I'm sorry, but we can't do this exhibition. I said, why? And he said, well, there's this large cell by Louise Bourgeois in the same space. And he said, well, you knew this. We sent you a detailed plan drawing with it, which said it could be over there. It's a huge space. And this has all been worked out. And I said, no, I want to do something with flesh. Okay, flesh, what do you mean? It's just 3 days before the opening. And he said, well, meat, horse meat. I said, okay. And he said, can you make a metal frame the size of Picasso's Guernica? Of course, you know that painting, and one of the notable images in that is the crying horse with the bombs and the death all around it. And so he made this this framework, and fitting it to the walls wasn't easy, and getting it done in this time of days was not easy. And on it we hung horse meat. And this created a huge stir, perhaps not as much as the horses themselves would have done, but they worried, the cleaners were worried about the blood dripping on the floor. I said, leave the blood, it's part of the work. When after a month or so it began to stink, we got fresh horse meat. But it was certainly a memorable work. And the second work we showed by Cunelis, which is entitled Libertà o Muerte, Liberty or Death, Viva, Long Live Marat, Long Live Robespierre, from 1969. So both these works from 1969. And there's a candle, a lit candle. Mario Merz was also the same figure from Italian art at this time. And we couldn't borrow the Japik Blue, which is in the collection of the Pompidou. It's too fragile. And we were going to remake it, and he agreed that we should remake it. And he did the same, absolutely the same thing as Yanis Cunelis. He said, well, at the last moment, no, we can't. I'm coming and I'll make you a piece specially. And as we'd given quite a considerable, important place over to this, it was difficult. So he made, and it was a much less good work, I have to say. He made it, it was installed there, but this is what was supposed to be there. With Cunelis, there was a royal opening, and there were men still on ladders, on hanging up the horse meat when the king entered the building. Thank God they'd actually got the ladders out the way and themselves out the way by the time he got to that bit of the gallery. So there was a slight heart stopper for Cunelis. This work by Beuys, Wirtschaftswerte, Economic Assets, gets back more clearly into ideas of, perhaps more practically as well, into ideas of ideology and history. Here there are paintings behind from the National Museum, and the instruction was that they should have been made between the birth and death dates of Karl Marx. And then here on the shelves are materials that he'd bought from the GDR, which were very badly packaged, we could say, and looked rather meager. And then in the center foreground there is a cube which is broken at the corners and was made whole by butter. So there was a very literal act of healing there by Beuys in this work. Now, the museum had a very good photographic collection, and in fact it had absorbed the Fotografiska Museum as part of it, and there were some remarkable things which weren't got out very often. And we took over the old prison, the old sailors' prison, just by the entrance to the museum, really to show smaller works and photographs with. And Larry Clark and some others you saw went in those spaces. Diane Arbus's. Kind of contemporary, aren't they, these Arbus pictures? Richard Billingham, a completely different generation, then very young, and really pictures of his family. You can see the scale of these is much larger than the Arbus or the Larry Clark images. And then historical images, Rachel Whiteread, this study for the Jewish memorial in the Judenplatz in Vienna. So playing with history in different ways, the wounds of history and how they were still present. Christian Baldansky's straightforward archives, a reserve for detectives from 1987. All these different photographs where you don't know where they come from, and the tin boxes where they could be hidden or brought out from. It's kind of funereal quality to the work. Or Willie Doherty, returning to the struggles in Northern Ireland, which we saw with Richard Hamilton, these images. This and a few other works from the exhibition were added to the museum collection. Or to the happenings in Latin America, in particular Argentina. This work by Victor Grupo, very important conceptual artist of the period, called Analog. It was in fact made at the time of the generals being in charge, and when there was widespread torture of all dissidents. And it's potatoes on a table which have been wired up, and they're connected to an ammeter which measures the current as the starch within the potatoes degrades. And so you can see on this ammeter the electrical charge being created. And for Grippo, this was something very much, the analog was of torture by electrical terminals, which was a common or the preferred way of the generals in dealing with people they didn't like. Or Doris Salcedo, who's a Colombian artist, and one of these and some other works by her were added to the collection, which is furniture but filled with concrete and small pieces of bone or cloth or buttons, something very much like, if any of you have been to Phnom Penh and to the pagoda, it's the so-called killing fields. Just walking around, you see these bits coming up to the surface of the earth, and you get the same feeling from these, but in these bourgeois pieces of furniture with the concrete piece, with things embedded in them. Damien Hirst, I mean, one had to make acknowledgement of the young British artists who were then militant across the world, but I think a very good work by him. 100 Years with the flies, the maggots hatching into flies and moving into another space for sugar, and as they do that, they're zapped by this fly killer. Or Douglas Gordon, it's a bit of a vintage film that he found, which was shot in a hospital. This severely disabled man trying to stand. Quite why it was photographed, no one knows. But time and time again, he tries to stand it. Eventually, he does. But it's a repeat, and then it's repeated again and again and again. On a slightly lighter note, Ilya Kabakov, at least some fantasy. The man who flew into space from his apartment. It's like one of his literary creations. So you can see the springs and the seat, which would have propelled the astronaut, the cosmonaut, strongly through the ceiling of his apartment, deep into outer space. And then in space, which were usually educational studios, education of children was very, very important, and it has been a pioneering museum in that respect. We put a whole sequence of these portraits. You see they're 153 centimeters high by Reineke Dijkstra, and they're all of young people around the Baltic area, just posed like this. It's like almost a Botticelli Aphrodite, but not very young. And then from this very small selection of work from the exhibition, we ended and in a sense began it with this performance by Vanessa Beecroft, using local models, which she always did. She was very unknown at that time. And it's based on a Helmut Newton photograph. You see there's a stars and stripes there. And there's a very uneasy relationship between Sweden and the US. On one level, there's a lot of admiration, particularly cultural admiration, a lot of deference to American culture. But politically, they were very, very far apart indeed. And these figures just standing there, facing people as they walked in, during the opening day, was something that people found extremely well challenging in a way of having to how to understand what this meant. Are there any questions at this stage before I go on to the next bit? Comments?
How did the Swedes receive it?
Well, a few received it with humor. It's hard to believe, in that they likened it to all the potholes in the Stockholm city streets, of which there were many, and they described these as wounds. But I think that people were, and I've never seen anything like it, frankly. It's showing just a relatively small part of the exhibition, and there's a big film program and video program as well. That it was this idea of it being full of art was something which and also the idea that modernity was rooted in the 18th century, in the late 18th century. Essentially, the structures and the power settlement that had been made at that time hadn't changed very much, and that artists were busy with this in their way, either some directly referring to this period, others not, but referring to the deficits of power that still mar culture and society. So, shall I move on? We've had wounds, and there are a lot of things in between. Dominic mentioned one of them, which was the After the Wall, Art and Culture in Post-Communist Europe. But this is about inaugural exhibition. I hope okay, inaugural exhibitions. And this was for Mori Art Museum in Tokyo. And you can see the museum, although you may not realize it. It's on the top 2 floors of that largest tower in the center, which is in Roppongi. Now, this slightly fuzzy photograph shows the district, because the museum was built as a kind of, well, jewel in the crown. It sounds fancy, but it was actually privately funded as a jewel in the crown of a 14-hectare development. So 14, it's large, really large in Tokyo, which had many different buildings in it by many different architects, residential, cineplexes, restaurants, hotels, lots of shops. And the museum was in the tallest building at the top of it. And only one thing was above it, which is a 360-degree view of the city. So the view from Stockholm had been across the water, and across the water to this kind of bucolic landscape. Here, it really was in the center of the throbbing heart of the city. And this is Roppongi, where it was situated. The 14 hectares is a little way up to your left, but you can see it says High Touch Town on that overway there. That's now been removed. No one quite knew what it meant, except they did, because it was a red light district for the American troops in the war, and well, in the Korean War and during the occupation of Japan after World War II. So that's Roppongi Crossing. And in fact, we gave the title of that to a 3-yearly exhibition of Japanese art. It's still happening, which really invites young curators to choose what they think is the most significant things that have been happening in Japanese art over the previous 3 or 4 years. So it's become a point of reference and critical consideration for changes in contemporary Japanese art. So it works well. And that's Roppongi. There it is, the flashing lights of the city. It's much less exciting now than it was when I lived there, but it still has its moments. And the whole district was called Roppongi Hills. And a different designer, not Tomato, but John Barnbrook worked on all of this and really started a relationship where I'm still working with him. And I was just knocked out, as indeed were other people on the jury. There was a jury held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, really to decide between 4 leading designers. John was the most unknown and had the smallest studio. Yet he came up with a logo for Roppongi Hills. So this sort of multi-billion-dollar development, and called Roppongi, which means 6 trees. That's the meaning of it. And then hills, because the developer, Mr. Mori's father, had made another development down the road called Arc Hills. And that was actually Beverly Hills. So Roppongi Hills sort of sounded groovy. So, but Roppongi Hills. And the 6 trees. That's what John came up with. It's just a brilliant solution to a difficult design problem. And it's still in use. And then there was the Mori Art Center, which was occupying the top 5 floors of the tower. We were 2 of those floors. And they're the different elements, the different strands of that in that logo. And that's the one that runs through the middle of it, which is the Mori Art Museum. Now, the first exhibition, Happiness, a survival guide for art and life, who I worked with, again, with Pierluigi Tazzi on it. And we decided that with the inaugural show. And I realized in this kind of very potentially fraught environment, commercial environment, the first exhibition had to be about something which no one could disagree with. And no one could disagree with happiness. So we made the exhibition about happiness. Survival Guide for Art and Life. They didn't know what a survival guide was. And I wasn't going to argue. So the title in Japanese was Contemporary Art from 5th Century China to Jeff Koons. Anyway, it's 366 works by 182 artists from across the world, from 5th century China to the present day. And the things that were uppermost in my mind at this time were set out here, slightly banally, questioning the limits of contemporary art and how it relates to the past and future. And I think that's important in the idea that art needs to stand up. It needs to stand up with things which are sympathetic. I mean, no point in creating a masochistic or a sadistic situation, but if it's any good, it will stand up with other things that are good. Show classic works from West and East alongside those of contemporary art. So bringing together different cultures of many, many different kinds, not just East Asian and so-called Western, but others too. Give visitors the space to experience and make their own minds out about contemporary art, well, very much like we were doing in Sweden. Expanding on the nature of happiness and how this continues to be a central topic of art, and to create an exhibition both enjoyable and challenging. So, Cecil B. DeMille, an exhibition that begins in the world and ends in the universe. Yes, who's going to disagree with that? And here's the slipcover for the catalog. You can see we combined, Barnbooks combined the Karnataka Japanese alphabet, which it uses for foreign words, and Roman letters. And there's James Rosenquist and Allegro Boetti in the 5th century China. That's the actual cover. And then happiness exists as a character in Japanese and Chinese. This is a Zen painting of 100 happinesses repeated over in different ways by Hakuin. But we started with the world and with this map, a map of the world by Allegro Boetti. As you can see, it's 1988, so just before the big changes of 1989. And I mean by that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the crumbling of the Eastern Bloc. And then ending with a series of paintings, or almost ending with a series of paintings by V. Selmins, Latvian artist who lived many years in New York, really of skies, of night skies. I think there were 4 or 5 of these. And then in between, well, you have to get into the museum to start off with. And Murakami was very popular commercially. And so why not? If you've got it, flaunt it. This actually led from the subway. It had its own subway entrance to the entrance of the museum, so you can find your way there. Because of course it is a complete labyrinth on many, many different levels. And we wanted to do works outside the museum as well as inside, just as had been the case in Stockholm. And this Superflex work was in a free shop in one of the basements. It was in a convenience store in one of the basements. And for about an hour every day, from maybe on every fourth day, a bell rang, and then for an hour, everything in that shop was free. And this is by Superflex, a Danish group, and it's completely opposite to the way how the rest of the place worked, and it seemed to work from their point of view. And getting it past, well, I didn't have to get it past Mr. Mori. I was doing the show, and he said this goes in, and he didn't disagree. He wasn't very happy, but he didn't disagree. And then a beer garden. Surasi Kusulwong, the Thai artist, Happiness You Can Drink, he set up a beer garden next to an 18th century classical Japanese garden, which was part of the complex. And then this was moved inside. You see, I don't unfortunately have any pictures of the beer garden in action, its original place, but it then moved inside as a kind of little relic. Happiness You Can Drink. David Madala, oh dear, who passed away just earlier this year. His Cloud Canyons, and it was down in one of the shopping malls. So in a circulation space between shops, this foam, reproducing foam machine. And then from the outside, where you reach the museum, you follow the Murakami brick road, and then you go into this cone, which has a spiral staircase, or you can go up in a lift. But the spiral staircase had Choi Hong-hwa, who is a Korean artist, and these flowers which took you up there, a sign of opening and congratulation, but these were breathing, they were aspirating, so going in and out. And then you get in the lift in the lobby, and you go up 52 floors, and then you end up here. This is the 52 floors, and the two works here, one by Morimura Yasumasa, Magnanimous Prayer. This is him in the form of a kind of deity, and then the Stairway to Heaven, built out of feathers by the Korean artist Choi So-yoon. And then you go up that escalator. You can see behind the Stairway to Heaven, because that leads to the museum main entrance. And the cow wallpaper again seemed perfect for Happiness. Oops, sorry, excuse me. By Andy Warhol. And that's the entrance desk. No one's there at the moment, but you would be greeted and you would get your ticket and catalogs and things there. So the exhibition was structured around the idea of a journey through 4 continents of happiness: Arcadia, Nirvana, desire, and harmony. So you would participate in this journey. We're starting with Arcadia, the idea that once upon a time everything was so much better than now, or that one day, far in the future, things will be so much better than they are today. So it have both your kind of Arcadia of the past or your utopia of the future. And interestingly, there's a lot of Arcadian imaging in classical Japanese and Chinese art. This is based on Chinese prototypes, of course, but it's from the 16th century. Well, they're showing the 4 elegant pastimes. It's men served by one woman. Oh, it's not. And there's a courtesan there by the look of it. And the 4 elegant pastimes are playing Go, playing the zither, the chin, drinking, and painting. what could be better? And then the modern utopia of the déjeuner sur l'herbe, a kind of key point in the history of modern Western art. And then to follow it with Pablo Picasso's version and Gauguin's Paradise, Fred Tomaselli. And then Gilbert and George sort of cottaging in Hampstead Heath. The people are all living near to beauty passing by. These are huge, 280 centimeters high by 315 wide. First shown in the Hayward Gallery back in 1971. They're pretty remarkable works and very Arcadian, echoed by this video that they made in the bush, in which they're standing in the bush and birds are tweeting by them. And another Arcadia, very, very different, French Republican version by Ferdinand Léger, Les Loisirs, homage to Louis David. Or the Picasso from Stockholm, which they kindly lent, La Source. And then this was teamed, not exactly by it, but not far away, with Charles Long's 3-to-1 in Groovy Green. You sit on the sofa and you can listen to music, special music in that. And again, it's a kind of slightly etiolated, geeky Arcadia. Henry Moore, the classic one. And then Xu Bing, which he kindly designed the washroom signs for us. See, that's women, it says women in his square word calligraphy. So we're using Roman letters, but with French, with the Chinese calligraphic Russian strokes. Children and men. And then film two of Arcadia. I mean, the revolutionary Arcadia of the 20s is already starting to crumble. Ziege Verthoff's Man with the Movie Camera. We had a space where we were showing these as part of the sequence. And even this, Leni Riefenstahl, the Berlin Olympia. So, you know, Arcadia got and gets co-opted. This is from North Korea on the left-hand side, abundant potatoes. And it was a subject, artists got given subjects by their brigade leaders, still do. And this was made at a time of a potato famine. And so you could have artistic or virtual potatoes with no real potatoes. And there was a painting on the same subject by a different artist in the show too. And then this, they have a stylistic affinity, I feel, with Jeff Koons, the policeman, which, although it's carved polychrome wood, it has a certain clunkiness to it. And then somehow we're democratizing the washrooms. So Xu Bing did the outside on the doors, and Fortune O'Brien, she did the interiors. This is the ladies' one, which is actually very decorative with different wallpapers and scented soaps. And then a very worrying male one in which these weird bronze objects are left in the urinals. So Nirvana, being the second part, is concerned with art and its relation to the spiritual, the metaphysical, and the sublime. And again, claiming continuums here. In the first room, there were many smiling figures, many of them Buddha, but also John Lennon. You can see the installation, get an idea of the installation here, of how things were put together in different ways. There's a Liu Fan right there, and also this object is by Liu Fan. This is Monet Water Lilies. These are John Constable cloud images. These are Kamakura, you'll see them properly. There we go. And then the corner installation, the corner installation, Bill Viola, shot at Jerid, which is this mirage in a desert, the kind of transcendence of light and air and land and earth and sky. or Robert Ryman's. Amitabha Buddha. James Lee Byers, who worked a lot in Japan. You see these works, sorry, they're jumping ahead. You see these works came from Toyota Museum, Municipal Museum of Art, and they'd worked with him quite extensively. And the John Constable clouds. Hamish Fulton. And Mark Lewis, a Canadian artist, large film projection. So moving on to desire, a different territory entirely. Material and physical, it's the gratification of drives and appetites. The floating world of transient desire, delight. Well, ukiyo-e, the floating world, is one of the main subjects of Japanese art, certainly of the Edo period, and comes out of the Buddhist mistrust, shall we say, of earthly appetites, of physical appetites, desire. And the Japanese managed to turn it into its head to make it a moral lesson, which was also wonderfully exciting and titillating. Oh, Philip Guston on the far wall, Louise Bourgeois here. Gillian Waring, Dancing in Peckham. Dancing and desire seem to go well. Tracy Emin, Why I Never Became a Dancer. Peter Blake, a British painter, pop art painter, or eating a hot dog, and Tom Vesselman's Great American Nude. Gilbert and George, Gordon's Makes Us Drunk. It's a wonderful video, which starts off with Land of Hope and Glory in it, and followed by, that's the sound, and then followed by Gilbert and George drinking gin, Gordon's gin, and just repeating over and over in a slurred way, Gordon's makes us drunk, Gordon's makes us very, very drunk. The André Darin speaks for itself. Marlene Dumas, two paintings by her, young woman and the boy. Again, this strange feeling she has with the body. And with this figure, Hote, the god of contentment and happiness. It couldn't be more different. Carl Guimaraes and Rivan Neuenschwander's Inventory of Small Deaths. It's a video of a bubble going across a landscape, which eventually bursts and then replaced by another bubble. And these 18th century Indian miniatures, this is of girls bathing, certainly to be watched artistically as well as in the flesh. And these Basoli school paintings from northern India, which are Punjab Hills, which are just remarkable about the Radha Krishna story. So Radha is very tearful when Krishna comes back after a very, very heavy night out with another girlfriend. You see he's holding a rather limp lotus blossom in his hand. But she gets her own back. And she blames the cat for the scratches inflicted by her lover. Whoops. And you can see the cat up here in the roof space. And she's obviously got scratches on her back. And here, the very hot colors of the red and the birds around show that a deeply passionate scene has been going on there. And then, of course, the shunga, the Japanese spring pictures, the prints, sorry, two shunga by Hokusai. And it was not normal to show these publicly at this time. We just did it. There was no question about it. And Thomas Ruff, these substrate images. It's a series of works that he did, having taken pornographic images off the internet and kind of digitally layered them these different ways so that they become full of desire but devoid of content. laughter, really as a part of desire, with these No and Kyogen masks of laughter. And Peter Land's video, maybe some of you know it, Joie de Vivre, in which he laughs and laughs and laughs and laughs till he breaks down. He absolutely breaks down. Mess. So lastly, we end with harmony. Something concerned with cosmogonies, systems that work, diversity and balance, bringing things together. It makes the best of how and what we are. And it suggests perhaps that the greatest happiness is the contemplation of the happiness of others. Yeah, not a bad message in this large commercial area. And just some amazing works from New York, this Nataraj of the Lord of the Dance. Krishna as the creator and destroyer. Shiva as the creator and destroyer. Tibetan tankas, talking about systems of worlds, cosmogonies. And there it looks like Yama's in the middle of that, Yama, the god of death, in consort with his partner. Fred Tomaselli, Web. A lot of circles, of Zen circles, excuse me. Bruce Naumann's The True Artist Helps the Word by Revealing Mystic Truths. Certain irony in that work. But you're never quite sure with Bruce Naumann. Yoshiwara Jiro, who was one of the leading member of the Gutai group in the 50s, kind of developing the Zen circle into a Western style avant-garde expression. Giulio Paolini, Mimesi. More Mimesi on the left by Maruyama Naofumi, River, these reflections. And the work by Boyce, Defense of Nature, one of his ecological works. Thomas Struth, Paradise. Oops. This is an island with 3,000-year-old pine trees on it in the south of Japan. Zhang Pei, Just for You, really one of the most important video avant-garde artists in China from the 80s. In this, many different children are singing "Happy Birthday to You," all in a kind of version of English, even though the people themselves are not English. Kim Jong-un, Swing, Mother's Mirror. Again, this mimesis. Yoko Ono's Men Piece, which we invited people to get involved with. And then lastly, Pascal Martin Tayu from Cameroon, his Happy Birds Day. Really made a work with birds and feeding birds and small video screens which were cast around the floor. So this is almost the end. I mean, the actual end, as I said, was it ends in the universe. So the Via Selmin's paintings of the starlit sky that I've shown you, but there was a coda. The first one was on Grand Drag sets were Closing Time. It's a mixed media installation. It looks like a shuttered door, and there's a sign that it's a bar paradise, and it's just about to close. But the hope is you could open the door, get in there and have a drink, except that there's a solid wall behind it. So that even if you open that door, you just walk into a brick wall. And then lastly, on a slightly nicer note, Nara Yoshitomo's photograph. He makes very good photographs, and we reprinted this as a poster, an offset poster, which people could roll up and take away with them. And it's Kabul, goat herders' children. Time then in Kabul, as now, terrible things were happening, awful poverty, war, and this image of a happiness of a small child. Just seemed to be the best note to end on. So, and just more or less come to an end, but I mean, showing you inaugural exhibitions for new museums is one way of concentrating a discussion. Just to say a few other things that I have worked with, the 17th Biennale of Sydney, which was The Beauty of Distance, Songs of Survival in a Precarious Age. And that was working on an even larger scale than in Tokyo. 2012, working in Kiev, The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Rebirth and Apocalypse in Contemporary Art. They wanted the rebirth and apocalypse. This was before the Maidan Square demonstrations. And when the communist regime was still covertly in command there. And in 2014 in Moscow, A Time for Dreams, 4th Moscow Biennale of Young Artists. So you had to be 35 years or younger to be in this. And what better? It seemed that we should invoke Martin Luther King at a time when it was being said that the younger generation didn't have dreams. A time of resurgent authoritarianism in Russia and repression elsewhere. So there were 84 artists and collectives with 120 works from 30 different countries, chosen from over 3,000 submissions. So there was an open submission for this, which was good. I enjoyed that very much and found a number of works which were included in that. And 23 of the participants were from Russia or CIS states. And yeah. And then 2016, which is the last large show of this kind that I've done solo, The Pleasure of Love, Transient Emotion in Contemporary Art, and this was for Belgrade, the 56th October Salon. I first went there when I was 18, when it was still Yugoslavia, before the awful wars, the fratricide, the sororicide, all that awful mess. And then it was Serbia. And what to do? The Pleasure of Love. No one can disagree with that either. Based on a song which was composed at the time of the French Revolution. The poem, the writer of it was actually died in the Bastille before they could guillotine him. Le plaisir d'amour ne reste qu'un moment, le chagrin d'amour dure toute la vie. The pleasure of love only stays for a second, for a moment. The pain of love lasts your whole life through. A proposition which was dealt with in that exhibition in so many different ways. And that's it.
Bravo.
So, I'm going to stop
Wow.
presenting. Yeah, okay, I'm back. Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to take any comments or complaints or questions or whatever. I mean, it's a lot, and it is. You know, it's a full life we lead, and it should be a lot. And what I hope is you feel or you agree is that these are structures which don't limit any art or artist, and they don't limit any observer. They're a toolbox, they're a prompt, they're a goad, maybe an inspiration if we're lucky. But that's one of the things. And here I've been talking about thematic shows. It's very different if you're showing, say, a geographical area. I mean, Art from Africa, for instance, which I did with Simon Jami. We were looking at the art of a continent there, and really wondering why previous exhibitions of art from Africa had been so bad, because they're always apologizing. They weren't showing art because it was just as good as stuff being made elsewhere. And it seemed that people weren't looking. And I deeply believe that you can look. You know, I worked for the Ukrainian show. I think I found 30 artists from Ukraine, near that anyway, out of the 100. And I wasn't having my arm twisted or anything. It was possible to do it. It was good. They fitted in. And there, of course, the context was that of once having been on the Silk Road, and that from the communist period onwards, having been cut off from that, would become a cul-de-sac. But the idea of Silk Road, east-west, west-east, and then also the north-south, south-north, in that Kiev was founded by Vikings, by so-called Rus, Kievian Rus, who were from the north. And of course, Slavic tribes, which were kind of lurking there anyway.
Right. Can you hear me, David?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, because I was during this talk, I mean, speaking exactly about the exhibition Wounds, the Moderna Museet, and then the Mori Museum, the happiness. The thing that I happened to be really impressed by during your presentation is that you actually also concentrated on the view from the museum. Because you clearly described not only the exhibition but also the way or the view that you can get from the museum as an architectural structure. And I found it deeply interesting because this is something about I would like to ask you about in terms of your curatorial experience relating to the idea of a museum as a healing instrument. Because describing the way how we look outside from the museum after the experience of having an exhibition, would you have any impressions about that moment when not only intellectually in terms of the knowledge provided, but also in terms of the certain emotional impulse, we somehow being informed or complemented by the exhibition as a sort of a healing instrument? I mean, there's this wonderful word in Polish, which is called, which you pronounce as opatrzenie. Opatrzenie has double meaning. The one because patrzeć is to look, and opatrzyć it's actually to heal the wounds. It hasn't had the direct. I mean, there are two different meanings for the same word, so they do not really intervene. But I find that the sort of pretty poetic relations between meaning of opatrzenie, that you heal the wound, and opatrzenie, the other meaning is that if you look too much at something, that you become indifferent to that throughout the process of looking. So it becomes overlooked slowly and slowly because of the process of the impulses of looking at something again. So metaphorically speaking, this somehow goes back to this really impressive description of not only about the exhibition, but about the view from the museum. How does this view affects you after you being informed by the exhibition, and also how to construct the exhibition to let it still within a viewer or let it remain within the viewer after he leaves the museum and when he looks at the world outside. That's why I found it so interesting that you described not only the exhibition but also the view from the museum.
Yeah.
And my question is basically about your curatorial experience in terms of the expectations, how to construct the exhibition, to let it last or let it live within a viewer who experiences the show and then looks through the window to the external world.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Dominic, you're bringing up a very important point, because this also poses a revolution against the old idea, which had become superseded, of the white cube. But the white cube, as Brian O'Doherty explains it, is essentially a self-referential space for showing self-referential work. But art hasn't been really self-referential in its aspirations since the 60s with minimalism and conceptual art. And I think everybody knows that today art is referential, and that by opening up the exhibition space to presuppose this fact with a view of the outside and making it referential de facto is a very important step forward. And it's also reflected, which probably Yehuda being more up to date with contemporary architecture knows better than I do, with new designers of exhibition spaces, especially the Thai architect based in California, Kulapad Yantrasast. All of his new exhibition space designs always are very scrupulous to include views of the exterior and surroundings. And he admits that it's specifically for this reason, that it's because the art is referential and so should be the exhibition space. And I think David has been a forerunner in this thinking. And of course, when, what David is too modest to mention very explicitly is that we see the words contemporary art in his title, but when he said, when David Elliott is using the term contemporary art, he means a condition that he's largely responsible for inventing as something which is entirely open to the world. So we saw works from East Asia, works from Cameroon, the Philippines, from India. And this is not only a matter of different times, but a matter of that's completely open to the world in every corner of the world. And this is a vision of contemporary art that I think many people now take for granted, because it's one that he really created from his earliest days as the director of the Oxford Modern Art Museum, when he started showing artists from countries that effectively did not exist in the world of contemporary art, where people believed that the term just presupposed Western Europe and the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think that the issue of contemporary is a semantic issue. Contemporary just means something that's made now. And it can be made anywhere. It doesn't say modern presupposes it's made in an advanced country, a so-called developed country, whereas contemporary just means nowness. So that opens up another question, which, okay, contemporary doesn't mean it's any good. Is it any good? In the modern period, the kind of its modernity kind of was a guarantee of it being good, so to speak, because of the progressive views of the people who made it. And there was a kind of catch-22, and thank God we're out of it. So it's opening up a different aesthetic discussion, a different moral discussion. We can go back to Kant. There's no problem. I mean, Kant was prepared to look at these things in his idea of the autonomous field, and it's really what makes art art. That it is art, but it doesn't necessarily make it good.
Well, one of the things I think that's important right now in this discussion is that this vision, this inclusive vision of the contemporary, is based on these things, like whether it's good. It's not based entirely on identity.
No. It's it has to be an open, this kind of judgment. We do these things individually, and we too are subject to our place and time and mood. But I mean, there is a more general discussion that can be made about quality and importance and relevance, and to whom. I mean, this is why art from Black communities has been marginalized so much, and only recently, certainly in Britain, is it beginning to be taken seriously. And also the colonial attitude, which still exists to other parts of the world in terms of culture, not in terms of money. They'll take money from anyone, but in terms of contemporary modern culture, no problem with classical Indian art. But it was only once the market in Indian art was supported by people from Southern Asia that it started to be taken as seriously as it should have been by many people in the West. And this is quite a late coming thing. Anyway. But the thing you're saying about the view from outside, yeah, for me this has got it's got to do with openness, but it also has to do with with ghosts. And in a way, if you're curating on a scale from outside, as one often is, you have to spend time thinking and working with the ghosts that are there. We share ghosts, I mean, from different cultures and all of that. It's just actually working out what they are and where they work and what triggers them. This is important. They're always ghosts. The ghosts of Roppongi are very different to those of Stockholm. And especially when the whole landscape has just been raised in this temple to God knows what has been raised in its place. But we were there too. We were like a shrine, actually. We had a shrine-like function in that space. I was very happy to fulfill it. And above us, as I said, was this 360-degree view of the city. Well, that was competition. To measure up to that, you had to be good. And that concentrated our minds. It concentrated our minds. What's all that life? And then, what are we doing? Yeah, right. And it's an attitude towards artistic production, towards what artists make, and trying, and then certainly not infallible, deeply flawed. But it's an approach which is intelligible, and I think is about sharing and adding, letting people add to what you do.
Would you yeah,
No,
would you perceive is there a difference, would you consider there are different kinds of courage as a curator you took upon working at the Moderna Museet and in Mori, speaking of the cultural field? Because as a curator, you have to take a certain amount of courage to create a statement. So I was wondering whether you face a different type of challenges in terms of the courage that you had to put on, whether you were in Japan or whether you were in Sweden. Or was it the same courage, really?
In Sweden, you were required to drink much more.
That's the courage.
Yeah, they are different. I mean, the points there was much more resistance in Sweden to anything one did than there was in Tokyo, where you had a highly educated population, large numbers of whom were interested in educated way in culture. I mean, the discourse, well, at times it was quite good, other times it was a little shallow. But in Sweden, you kind of triggered deep-held prejudices, which I didn't find any in Japan, really, because they're too polite to show them. Of course they have them. Of course they have them, but they're far too polite to show them. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I had very few fights in Japan, whereas in Sweden there were a few battles. I mean, I had animal rights people who got upset about things and animal rights, and then there was the child abuse, and the Björn Melgård video I showed, you know, but it's you get paid for it. That's part of the job, and it's no good moaning about it. You have to. But the thing is, I think a lot of people now, and it's different. Going back to the end of the 90s in Sweden, the social media weren't present, so it's a different climate. I mean, if people wanted to send me hate mail, they had to write it. Or they'd send me an email, and you couldn't tweet it. So I think it's very different, and I sense amongst younger colleagues that they're very concerned about threats and things. I mean, I had discussion at the CMAM conference. CMAM is the International Committee of Museums of Modern Art in Singapore 2 years ago, and Guggenheim Museum had pulled a couple of works by Hu Han-ru, and one of them had animals in it, and I've forgotten what the other work was. But they'd been threatened by animal rights people. Now, there was no problem of animal rights. There was no cruelty in the work, but they'd been threatened, and the museum pulled it. And it was it was a historical show looking at the development of the new Chinese art from the end of the 70s. And I said, isn't this just cowardly? You should show it. It's there.
Right.
As long as it's not cruel. And I was strongly criticized, saying I didn't know how things are these days, and you should really wise up. So I think one does need to step. If you're a director of Museum of Modern Art, I was brought up to believe you should stick your neck out, and you should also advocate for the art, for the artist. And I still believe that, but I wouldn't say the artist is always 100% right, and now that neither is the director or the curator. But maybe
we got hell over that Sunyan and Pangyu piece with the dogs on treadmills.
Yeah, that'd be difficult to show today. Yeah, because of the heavy breathing. They were. You could argue they were distressed. But there's a video of it. You can show the video.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Sunwan and Pangyu works which are quite difficult to show. Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree, David, that there is a certain difference in terms of the censorship and accepting certain explicit vocabulary of art, which depends on a different relation? Speaking of my experience in being in Japan and familiar with the Western culture because of my origins, that there is the difference in terms of something which you already described in a beautiful way as chasing ghosts. Because from that, what I could realize during my shows in Japan and my experience, that there is this huge separation, a big difference between the between the fantasy, which can be very often explicit, but as long as it's fantasy, it's absolutely legal. It's possible. And so there is this world of ghosts, and then there is this reality, which in European culture is much more intertwined. That's why you have these all historical type of censorship that still are affecting us in terms of showing certain content. Because there's this confusion between the reality and between the fantasy, whereas in Japanese culture, you have ghosts and you have the fantastic world, okay? And then you have the reality. And they do not mix that much, that strongly, or there are strong in separation between the two. Or is it complete bullshit what I'm saying now?
I'm not sure. I mean, the Japanese do have a kind of split between the floating world and which is it's a world of illusion, and they certainly enjoy it hugely. But I mean, what you have in West, America included, and Sweden included, and Germany included, and Britain, is Puritanism. Now, in Catholic countries, you also have a kind of censorship, but I think Puritan idea is very, very strongly ingrained in Western mentality, and it's all about material, and it's about possession. Possession is the most important thing, and they are more abstract in their thinking about. I mean, it's a huge subject that you've raised, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it, but I mean, on many things, the audiences are quite similar. They're not the kind of focus groups that you have, say, in animal rights. Environmental rights, yes, now because of Fukushima, Kyoto Agreement, and all this, so people are very environmentally aware. But I mean, feminism, it's always difficult in Asia talking about feminism, because very often women, artists who I regard as feminists, don't particularly want to be called feminists, because they find that themselves associated with a kind of strident Western way of expressing, which, I mean, I respect, but now I would say generation of women in their 40s and younger, you do find a much more assertive expression of female personality, psychology in literature and in art, and that's marked, and it's been showing for the past really since the turn of the century, even before, even in the 90s. I mean, you have outliers, someone like Yoko Ono or Kusama Yayoi, but now there's a strong, one would say, a strong women's movement now. And like this guy who just had to resign from the Olympic Committee because he suggested that a female comedian should dress a pig to open the Olympics. I can't think what he was thinking of, to be honest. But anyway, people found it offensive, not surprisingly. Maybe it's a very obscure joke. But that wouldn't have happened before. Nor Mori, who's the chairman of the Japanese Olympic Committee and a former prime minister of Japan, he had to resign because they're saying that women talk too much at the meeting. Bloody good job. He absolute total reactionary. Awful. So one raises more questions than one really gets grips with them. There's been a lot of art.
There is a difference in just to end this my the reference that there is a difference in linguistic difference in Japanese and in English relating to shadow. In English we say to cast a shadow. In Japanese is kagewo otatsu, which means to drop a shadow. I think it makes huge difference.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the leading books on modern Japanese aesthetics is called In Praise of Shadows. And it's also by a novelist whose name has just gone out my head. But it's a very famous book on that. And he likes the darkness and the shadows of traditional Japanese houses, is basically saying that this is this softening of outlines and blurring of distinctions is very important.
Sounds like Tanizaki.
Tanizaki, yeah, thank you. Good. Happy to answer any other questions if there are.
We are hoping for some students' voices, but still,
Yeah.
Only the more mature ones. Is there anybody else, maybe from the audience?
Anyone out there? Ground control to Major Tom. Well, I think silence is not a problem.
I think we are overwhelmed by the amount of material that we perceived. So that's also something to think over again. And I think probably part of the audience would like to listen to the lecture again, which will be available on recorded, without the chance to ask questions. Because
the question, and send the question to me. That's fine.
I wanted to ask a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Sure.
Yes, of course.
Oh, perfect. I wanted to ask if you did you meet with any political censorship during your exhibitions in Russia and Ukraine? Because well, right now it's any critical political art is a one-way ticket to prison. Same in Belarus. That's why I'm curious. How was it in 2014?
No political censorship in Ukraine, although people tried to warn me off. The Mistetsy, the Arsenal, if you know Kiev, it's right next to the old Lavra, the historic, the oldest cathedral church in Kiev. And they said no blasphemy. And there was a work by the Chapman brothers. A couple of works. One was a kind of reimagination of the Entartete Kunst exhibition in Munich in 1938, with SS officers looking at examples of modern art today, of heavy metal sculpture, not at the Antarctica artists of the period. But the other work was of a guy in a figure, standing male figure, wearing a Ku Klux Klan helmet with multicolored, rainbow-colored scarf, looking at a crucifixion images in the style of the Bruegels, but Mickey Mouse heads have been painted on them. And he also had a huge erection. And they didn't complain or stop it, ask for it to be taken down or anything like that.
And what about Russia?
Russia, no. I mean, there were works that were very ostensibly about gay things, which I thought, as there was a big debate at that time, that they should be there. Isaac Chong-Wai, an early work that he made about, he met a guy in Buchenwald concentration camp, hated him, as a statement. And a very strong work, but there was no. The minister Medinevsky refused to come to the opening and sent his assistant, who was very nice and supportive. But I think the process is much slower. I mean, Pussy Riot. I mean, part of their work is looking for trouble. This was in the Museum of Moscow, so it wasn't on the streets. And I think there's a big difference if you're on the streets, or particularly in the cathedrals themselves. You can run into trouble there. But also things have got much tougher now than they were back in 2014.
Thank you for the answer.
Pleasure.
Is there something we have in Poland now? Speaking of the censorship in Russia, I'm not aware of. I'm discussing I'm thinking of the offense that you can be prosecuted because of offending the religious feelings.
Yeah, blasphemy law. That can mean anything, I think. I mean, you've got to be careful with that one. There are no major cases at the moment, I think, going up. And, so it's been relatively quiet for a while. But yeah, but yes, blasphemy is the big thing in Russia. Of course, in China, there's a lot of censorship, but it's very random. So if you're a regular contributor to the party and you've got the right friends, you can do more or less what you like in your private museum. If you're not, they have to get they have a censorship department. They have to get their quota of things they stop. So you're very, very vulnerable. I've had shows stopped in China for stupid reasons. I mean, ridiculous.
What is your next big challenge, David, if I may ask?
Well, I mean, the publication of a book, I hope that won't be a challenge, but getting to the stage where it's published has been the challenge, and that will be this September. And that's the one you mentioned in your introduction, kindly. Art and Trousers, Tradition and Modernity in Contemporary Asian Art. It's
a beautiful title.
about the whole question of tradition and modernity. Asian art is the pretext for talking about this, and is the focus for it, that you can extend it far beyond that. And it's also about cultural transmission. and how it doesn't go just one way. I mean, the modernist myth is it just goes one way. It doesn't and never has. It's completely promiscuous. And trousers are very promiscuous. I mean, the oldest images of trousers are on mammoth tusks from eastern Siberia 25,000 years ago. The oldest extant trousers are from Xinjiang province in the Taklamakan desert, and worn by Caucasians. There were Caucasians living there at that time. Yeah, there's a kind of interesting history which actually completely confounds prejudice about how things are and were and the way how culture flows, because it flows unpredictably. Thank God. And there's an exhibition coming up at Momentum at Easter. It's opening in the Zionskirche in Berlin. And I'm just an advisor on it, and Momentum have put this together. And it's called Points of Resistance. Looking at in the context of the history of that place, which was built immediately after the German war with Denmark, and then consolidated with money from the war against France in 1870. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor there, and in the DDR time, when it was a ruin, it had been ruined in the war, the basement was used as a meeting place for opposition to the regime. And a lot of the meetings which are planned, which brought down the wall, emanated from that part, and other churches as well. So it's a very redolent spot. And then there's the exhibition is.
And this is on now, or when is
it? Opens in Easter weekend, I think. It'll be running for 3 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you.
So,
if I may have one literary footnote, that if this talk has inspired anyone to take a more specific interest in Japanese contemporary art, there's one book that I think that I'm lucky to have, which I think is a masterpiece of art history on this subject, and it's called Bye Bye Kitty. Happening held in contemporary Japanese art. The author is David Elliott. Published by the Japan Society and Yale University Press. And I think there's probably no better book in any language on contemporary Japanese art history.
Anyway. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, if students do have any questions, I mean, they should just then drop me a note, and I'll do my best to answer. But anyway, it shows what can be done with a certain attitude. So that's what the aim was. Thank you all.
Well, David, thank you so much for wonderful lecture.
Great pleasure. Yeah.
We're overwhelmed with the amount of material, so we will have to sleep it over with. But it's been incredible pleasure to have you here.
Great.
And thank you for all incredible input that you gave us. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
And thank you all. Thank you for the discussion. And I'm very, very pleased that it all was possible and it all happened. So
yeah, no, it worked very well.
So it's been great.
Good. Thank you
so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you, Yehuda.
Good to see you. Good to see you all.
Yeah.
And we'll see each other next time, I hope, soon. I'll let you know about the next time of the next date of the lecture. So I hope you'll be able to also join us within the next discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. Good.
Brilliant. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.